September 29, 1986. John Gotti stands outside the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street straightening his tie. The photographer from Time magazine adjusts his lens. In 3 hours, this image will be transmitted to printing presses across America. By morning, John Gotti's face will stare back from newsstands in 47 states. What nobody understood that day, not the photographer, not the editors, not Gotti himself, was that this single magazine cover would trigger the most comprehensive surveillance operation in FBI history. 2,147 hours of recordings, 6 years of systematic observation, and the complete destruction of a power structure that had survived for decades through one simple principle: invisibility. The cover story would call him the Dapper Don, but federal agents had a different name for him: Target Number 1. Traditional organized crime in America operated on a fundamental understanding: power without visibility, influence without recognition, control exercised through intermediaries, suggestions, and unspoken expectations. For 70 years, this system had worked because it remained largely invisible to public consciousness. John Gotti changed that equation, not through miscalculation, but through deliberate strategy. By 1986, the landscape of power in America was shifting. The Reagan era had created a culture of celebrity and excess. Wall Street raiders became household names. Corporate executives appeared on magazine covers. Success, once modest and private, had become performance art. Gotti understood this transformation better than his contemporaries. He recognized that in modern America, visible power often carried more weight than invisible power. A man who commanded headlines could influence decisions beyond his immediate reach. Politicians, judges, prosecutors, all operated within a media environment where public perception shaped institutional behavior. So Gotti made a calculated decision. He would step into the light. The Gambino family had always been disciplined about public exposure. Under Carlo Gambino, members avoided photographers, declined interviews, and maintained legitimate business fronts that suggested modest success at best. Gambino himself lived in a middle-class Brooklyn home and drove ordinary cars. His power was absolute, but it remained hidden. Paul Castellano, Gambino's successor, understood this principle but began to test its boundaries. He built a mansion on Staten Island. He conducted business from expensive restaurants. But even Castellano maintained plausible deniability. He could be explained as a successful businessman with unfortunate associates. John Gotti eliminated plausible deniability entirely. He wore suits that cost more than most Americans earned in a month. He held court outside the Ravenite Social Club where television cameras could document his presence. He organized public celebrations in his Queens neighborhood, complete with fireworks and street festivals. When arrested, he smiled for photographers instead of hiding his face. This visibility served a specific function. It demonstrated that Gotti was untouchable, that he could operate openly because the system couldn't or wouldn't stop him. Every public appearance was a display of immunity, and for a brief period, this strategy worked brilliantly. Prosecutors hesitated to bring cases they might lose publicly. Police avoided confrontations that would generate sympathetic media coverage. Politicians discovered that attacking someone with significant public support carried political risks. Gotti's visibility had created a protective shield, but visibility also created something else: a target. The Time magazine cover appeared on September 29, 1986. The headline read, "The New Godfather." The story described Gotti as the most powerful crime boss in America, a figure who had successfully defeated federal prosecution while maintaining control of a vast criminal enterprise. Inside FBI headquarters in Washington, Assistant Director John Glover read the article with particular attention. For months, Federal agents had debated resource allocation. The Bureau had limited surveillance capacity. Hundreds of organized crime figures operated across the country. Which ones deserved the most intensive attention? The Time magazine cover answered that question definitively. Within 48 hours, Glover had authorized Operation Family Secrets, the most comprehensive surveillance program ever directed at a single organized crime figure. The operation would involve rotating teams of agents, sophisticated electronic monitoring equipment, and coordination with multiple federal agencies. The paradox was perfect. Gotti's visibility, which had protected him from casual prosecution, had made him the highest priority target for systematic federal attention. The surveillance began immediately. Agents photographed every person who entered or left the Ravenite Social Club. They documented Gotti's movements, his meetings, his routines. They installed listening devices in apartments above the club. They monitored telephone lines, recorded conversations, and built comprehensive profiles of everyone in Gotti's organization. Traditional organized crime figures could disappear into anonymity when federal pressure increased. They could reduce their public presence, conduct business through intermediaries, and wait for attention to shift elsewhere. But Gotti had built his authority on visibility. He couldn't become invisible without appearing to retreat, and retreat would undermine the very foundation of his power. So he maintained his public presence while federal agents recorded everything. The recordings revealed the internal workings of the Gambino family with unprecedented detail. Conversations about murders, extortion, illegal gambling, and corruption were documented with perfect clarity, but more importantly, the recordings captured Gotti's own voice discussing these activities without the careful language that had protected previous generations of organized crime leaders. In one recording from March 1987, Gotti discussed the murder of Robert DiBernardo with complete candor. He was a rat. He was a rat. He was a rat. We had to do it. In another, he described payoffs to corrupt officials. We got judges, we got lawyers, we got cops. Everybody's got a price. Previous organized crime leaders had understood that every conversation might be recorded. They spoke in code, used intermediaries, and avoided explicit discussions of illegal activities. But Gotti's public persona had created an expectation of openness that extended to private conversations. The federal response was systematic and patient. Instead of rushing to make arrests based on individual recordings, agents continued surveillance for years, building a comprehensive case that would be impossible to defeat in court. They documented not just individual crimes, but the entire structure and operation of the criminal enterprise. By 1990, federal agents had compiled evidence of murder, racketeering, extortion, illegal gambling, and corruption involving dozens of individuals. The surveillance operation had generated thousands of hours of recordings, hundreds of photographs, and detailed documentation of criminal activities spanning several years. But the most damaging evidence came from Gotti himself. His visibility had not only attracted federal attention, it had made him overconfident about his ability to avoid consequences. The recordings revealed a man who believed his public status made him immune from prosecution. In a conversation recorded in December 1989, Gotti dismissed concerns about federal investigation. Let them listen, let them watch. What are they going to do? I'm John Gotti. I'm all over the newspapers. I'm all over television. They can't touch me. That confidence proved fatal. The federal indictment was announced in December 1990. Gotti was charged with racketeering, murder, obstruction of justice, and illegal gambling. The evidence included hundreds of hours of recorded conversations, testimony from former associates, and documentation of criminal activities spanning a decade. More significantly, the prosecution team had learned from previous failures. They had built a case that didn't depend on a single witness or piece of evidence. Even if individual elements were challenged successfully, the overall pattern of criminal activity was undeniable. The trial began in January 1992. For 2 months, jurors listened to recordings of Gotti's own voice discussing murders, planning crimes, and directing criminal activities. They saw photographs documenting his movements and meetings. They heard testimony from former associates who described the internal workings of the criminal organization. Gotti's defense strategy relied on the same visibility that had initially protected him. His attorneys argued that he was being prosecuted because of media attention, not because of evidence. They suggested that the federal government was responding to public pressure rather than pursuing justice, but the recordings spoke for themselves. On April 2, 1992, John Gotti was convicted on all charges. The jury deliberated for 13 hours. The verdict was unanimous. Gotti was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The conviction marked more than the end of Gotti's criminal career. It demonstrated the fundamental incompatibility between modern media attention and traditional organized crime operations. The system that had protected organized crime leaders for decades, invisibility, deniability, and distance from criminal activities, could not survive in an environment of constant surveillance and media scrutiny. Gotti's successors learned this lesson. They returned to the traditional model of invisible leadership, modest lifestyles, and careful separation from documented criminal activities. None sought media attention or public recognition. The 2008 47 hours of surveillance recordings were stored in federal archives. They represented not just evidence of criminal activities, but documentation of how modern law enforcement could systematically dismantle criminal organizations when those organizations became visible enough to justify intensive attention. John Gotti died in federal prison on June 10, 2002. His death received significant media coverage, but by then the lesson was clear. Visibility and criminal power could not coexist in modern America. The system would always respond to public challenges with overwhelming force. The Time magazine cover from September 1986 remained in federal case files as evidence, not of criminal activity, but of the moment when John Gotti chose visibility over survival. That choice had made him famous. It had also made him vulnerable. And in the end, vulnerability destroyed everything he had built. Power without visibility can endure for generations. Power with visibility attracts the full attention of institutions designed to eliminate it. John Gotti proved that equation definitively. The cost was everything he had worked to control.